So what is typography? Typography is the composition of printed material from movable type. The art and technique of this, the arrangement and appearance of printed matter. So I'm just looking at the definition of typography right now, but the images that you see surrounding the definition is actually images of the old letterpress printing method that was around for over 500 years before computers were invented. And letterpress printing is a relief printing process which utilizes raised engravings and metal type. So you see the boxes over here with all the metal type inside. What it does is it imprints designs and words on a piece of paper or page. It originated in the early 1400s, and it was the main form of printing for many, many, many years, over 500. So there's a lot of terminology that comes from this letterpress printing. And the terms that we still use today, leading and kerning, for example, point size, are all from this process that originated in the 1400s. So lead type was the actual blocks of lead that were used to press down onto the paper. And the digital equivalent is now used with computers. And you can see that what they would do is they would lay these letters down on the page, and they would use these lead strips to put between the letters or between the lines. And these strips were called leading, which is what we use today. So leading is the amount of space between lines, that's the definition, and kerning is the amount of space between two characters. And it was the same process, but sometimes you would put the lead strips between the actual lines, and sometimes you would put the lead strips between the characters, and sometimes you would put the lead strips between groups of characters. So it just depended. So you can see that here's some examples, before kerning and after kerning. So kerning in the computer is where you sort of take two letters and you tighten them up or make them a little bit looser, depending on if they're too tight or too loose. And a lot of times we kind of assume that the software that we're using is going to kern and lead right, but it doesn't. And so you always have to look at your spacing and then adjust, even when you're working in a software program like Illustrator. It doesn't naturally lead or kern correctly, so it's up to the designer to make sure that it looks right. If it's too loose, it'll be hard to read, and if it's too tight, it'll be hard to read. So you want to get that sort of perfect balance most of the time. Tracking is another term used in typography, and tracking is the amount of space between a string of characters. And so this is an example. And so you can see here that you have tight tracking, which is where the letters are really close. You have normal tracking, and then you have loose tracking. And it loosens or tightens the selection of text. 12-point type is the actual size of the type, and that varies depending on how big or small you want the type to be. So that when it's measured in point size, 12 is going to be kind of the standard when you're in the computer, and you can make it larger or you can make it smaller. So 10-point type would be a little smaller, and 14 or 16-point type would be larger. Whereas it's also measuring the line spacing. So 14-point line spacing is sort of the normal default line spacing that's going to occur, but sometimes that needs to be adjusted. And the way that you kind of communicate it is you put a 12 first, then dash, then a 14, and it's pronounced 12 on 14. So we can see here some different experimentation, and with leading, many factors affect the interline spacing or leading of the text, including the height of the lowercase letters and the respective height and depth of the ascender and descenders. So an ascender is the upward vertical stem that goes sort of above above the X height. And so you can see this L here has an ascender. The H has an ascender, where that little line kind of goes above the X height of the other letters. And the height of the ascender is an identifying characteristic of many typefaces. The descender is the part that goes a little bit lower. So the G, for example, or the lowercase p have descenders, and that letter will extend below the baseline of a letter, such as X. So X will be not have an ascender, but that little curve of the G will go below the X. So here, let's just look at a couple of things. If we were a designer and we were analyzing this, you can see on the left, the leading and kerning are too close. And on the right, it's much easier to read once it has been adjusted. And here you can see a paragraph. And this is very tight. This is a little bit looser. This might be what's chosen, and this might be a little bit too loose. If it gets too loose, then it reads more as lines rather than a block. And this is just purposely a design that's purposely making it loose to communicate a message. The text says, "I hope you enjoy this experience." And if you do make your kerning or your leading or your tracking too loose, it's going to slow down the process of reading the text, which if you want to intentionally do that, that can be a good strategy. But if you don't want to intentionally do that, it can be sort of irritating or annoying for someone who's looking at the design. So these are very common fonts used all the time. You watch the movie Helvetica. So Helvetica is a really common font used a lot. Futura, Universe, Optima, Gaudi, Garamond, they're probably all traditional typefaces that you recognize and have used in the past. And so you can kind of break these fonts or these common fonts into families. And so we'll talk a little bit about the families. Old style is similar to the hand lettering of the scribes. It's good for a lot of text. There's nothing too distracting, and the fonts look the same. So you can see here in the words, there's these little things called serifs. So serif is a little, it's a little edge that goes off a letter, or a little line that goes off a letter. Sometimes people call it a boot. And so with old style fonts, you often see these serifs on lowercase letters, and they're often slanted. So notice the L here, the D has a little slanted serif. And then there's these transitions. So the stroke of the letter, it can be uniform where there's no thick, thin transition, but in old style fonts, there's usually a pretty moderate thick, thin transition in the stroke. So notice the O. There's a definite transition from the thickest part of the letter to the thinnest part of the letter, and the same with the S. And then there's a diagonal stress in old style fonts. So you see that it kind of tilts a little bit. Instead of going straight up and down, there's a tiny tilt to that O. And there's a diagonal stress on the D as well. And fonts that kind of fall into this family, Gaudi, Palantino, Times, Bakersfield, Garamond, so those are all considered old style fonts. Modern, this family, a lot of these fonts were invented during the time when a lot of mechanical inventions were being created. They're very cold and elegant. They have a striking appearance. And the reason they have this very striking appearance is because they have very strong, thick, thin transitions. Notice that O there, where the thickest part is much, much, much thicker than the thinnest part. There's a vertical stress here where it's just kind of at the top of the letter and at the bottom of the letter. And these radical thick, thin transitions in the strokes and the serifs on the lowercase letters are very thin and horizontal. So Bodini, Times Bold, Fennis, Ultra, Walbaum are all fonts that are considered in part of the modern family. But notice that even the one word modern It's really beautiful, but imagine that in a whole sentence. It can be really hard to read it. So fonts that are in this sort of modern family are hard to read if you put a lot of text together. So it might be appropriate for maybe a sentence, maybe a few words, but not good for lots of copy. If you have a paragraph in one of these fonts, it can be really hard to read. Then you have slab serif. Slab serif, Clarendon, Memphis, Memphis Extra Bold, New Century School Book, all fonts in this family. There are serifs on lowercase letters here. They're horizontal and thick, so they're much thicker than when we were looking at the modern family. And there's not very much thick-thin transition. There's a little bit, so it's a thin transition. So the thickest part of the letter is not that much different than the thinnest part. And there's definitely these pronounced serifs on the lowercase letters. They're very thick and pronounced, and there's a vertical stress in the thick-thin transitions. And so this family, or fonts in this family, are actually pretty legible. So they are acceptable for extensive text. A lot of times you'll see these fonts used in advertising or in children's books. They have sort of a decorative quality, but they're still legible. Then you have sans serif, which is a 20th century invention, and we all saw the movie Helvetica, so we know that Helvetica is in this family, sans serif, and very legible, no serifs anywhere, no stress because there's no thick-thin transition, and there's no strokes in any of the letters. That's sort of what distinguishes all sans serif fonts, no strokes. And so very legible, used extensively in advertising and design. And then you have what's called script. And script sort of mimics the calligraphic pen. Very beautiful, very ornate, but you have to use it sparingly. Look at those beautiful words down there, but imagine the block of text would be almost impossible to read. And never use all caps with this family or the fonts in this family, because then it is literally impossible to read it. You want to maybe capitalize one word, or sorry, one letter in a word. Then there's also a lot of fonts. I don't have a slide of it, but there's a lot of fonts that are just sort of decorative, trendy. Each letter has unique characteristics, and there's no real family for that. They are created all the time where they don't really match any particular family. And so you can kind of decide if you want to use a more decorative font that's kind of a one-off. You have to be careful sometimes because decorative fonts or fonts that have been created by designers specifically for a business can be really recognizable and sort of reference the product that they were originally created for. So just make sure that if you do pick a font that's out there that's considered decorative or current or trendy, that it's not going to be really dated very quickly, or it's not going to remind your audience of something else. So text in design. So one important thing when you're designing with text is to establish visual hierarchy. So typographic elements should always be arranged according to emphasis. And you think about, as a designer, which typographic element is the most important to read first, maybe second, and then third. So looking at this design, definitely we would read here. And then they're using scale sort of as a strategy here, where you would want to maybe get close and read this line of text. The text down here, you're not necessarily going to read it at all, but it's there for some reason. The designer had to put it in. There's also a little bit of text up here that I don't think I would read. I would look at this design and I might read this line and this line. I might read a little bit down here, but maybe not. Maybe the date or some information that I thought was important. So that's visual hierarchy, establishing what you're going to look at first, second, third. And then as a designer, when you use text, especially text with graphics or imagery, you're trying to establish sort of a visual cooperation that occurs within design. A lot of times, new designers, when they're working with text, will just sort of slap it on. They put it on top, they put it in a space, they don't quite know what to do with it. The best designs really strategize how you can create this cooperative action between the visuals and the type. Sometimes the type will actually become the visual, and that can be really cool and interesting. There's a famous designer named David Carson. We're going to learn more about him later on in the course. But he was the art director for a magazine called Ray Gun. And Ray Gun is just a really interesting magazine to look at because the designs are just all over the place. He was very experimental with his usage of type, and he created what was known as sort of a grunge style. And there's a quote from him that is kind of cool, kind of makes you think. And the quote is, "Don't mistake legibility for communication." And so as we kind of go through the course, you're going to see different philosophies of thought based around typography. And you already looked at that when you watched the movie Helvetica. And some designers feel that it's really important that type is always legible and always clean and readable in a design. And other designers are much more free with it and don't think that's important. And so that's what I love about that movie Helvetica is there's so many different opinions, so many different designers weighing in on what they think about the font Helvetica, which is actually kind of a universal design font created specifically for graphic design. So kind of think about it as you watch Helvetica, as you learn more about typography, and see where you fall. What's your opinion on this? It will be a question this week that's asked in our Helvetica research paper. So the font you choose can convey a lot of emotion. And so just look at the word here. There's love and there's hate. The way that you put it on the page, the font that you choose makes a huge statement. The UK government did this advertisement where they put this really colorful childlike writing against this more like thick advertising legible letters. And you can see that this think advertisement uses contrast with a serif font with very colorful childlike writing, and it creates this very effective campaign poster. So there is this sort of rule of thumb where you're not supposed to use more than 2 fonts, but sometimes you will use more than 2 fonts. But if you are using 2 fonts, maybe you want those 2 fonts to be really different so that they create contrast. So I would say you can use just 1 font, that's fine. You can use 2 fonts, but if you use 2 fonts, think about the contrast of the 2 fonts and what it's going to communicate. Amnesty International did this dramatic poster using very large and very small type overlaying a stark black and white image. And it's a really powerful message. And you really need to look closely at this poster to read all the text. But when you first read it, "My decision is for rape" seems really shocking. But when you get in and read the little text here, which I'll read to you because I don't know if you can see it, it says, "My camp is my home, and the men here are part of my family. I don't want to let them die by the hands of the militia. But I made a decision in order to keep the men out of danger. I get the firewood myself. That is my gift for them, to face rape every day." So it's a pretty powerful message, but when you see it, and it's really good poster design because when you see it, you're sort of captivated and interested because the statement is so violent and so ugly. But as you get closer, you realize that it's all about this sacrifice or this decision. So it's much different than what you initially think or feel. And it's a beautiful example of visual hierarchy where you're going to read a message and then you're so captivated and interested by what these little words say that you're going to get close and want to keep discovering or reading the text. This is an interesting poster because I love the font. It kind of reminds me of David Carson, that grunge style, but there's a definite contrast going on here with this really aligned block of text that's really easy to read and really organized. And then this really sort of chaotic, energetic sort of messy graphic, very gestural graphic. And I love the balance and the contrast between Headbanger and the font that's in this one little block here. So using contrast can be a really powerful way to put text in if you have a lot of text or some copy that you have to include that needs to be legible, and then some text that can be more free. It's a great ad campaign for hunger. And oh, sorry, not for hunger, for homogenization. The world is full of generic, mass-produced, homogenized products. Don't become one. And they're just using that price tag. So here's another example of contrast. Look how different the apocalypse is from the image. The image showing this happy, beautiful couple frolicking in the water, and then this really dramatic, ugly, dangerous word all in black. Sometimes designers use a technique called ghosting, and this is ghosting with a graphic, but they put text in sort of a transparent shape above the image so that it stands out and stays legible. If you have sort of a lot of information in a design and you're trying to put the text on top, but then underneath there's this image and the image is competing with the text, this can be sort of a great strategy to use. I like this campaign by Bic because it's so clever and it's really communicating the product beautifully. Bic is a lighter, and so it's giving you that energetic feel of the flame and how the flame would move. And sometimes you just want to use hand-drawn font. So a lot of times designers will just draw the text and then scan it in and put it into their design. And I'm going to encourage you to do that with this next project. You can actually draw your letters out really carefully with black ink, scan them in, put them into a software like Illustrator, vectorize, and then manipulate in Illustrator. Love the use of positive negative space here and how the text is really interacting with that graphic really beautifully and communicating a strong message. This is kind of, nice that it's a snowboard, skateboard company. It's a snowboard company, I think, but they also sell other things. But I love how they put the text here, and they created the graphic actually using all of this hand-drawn text. And so that was a really nice strategy. It has a lot of information, but you really have to analyze it and think about it and look at it. This was a design firm doing sort of a promotional campaign, and you can see how this text is really becoming part of the image, interacting with the image. It's a cooperative visual. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about what you're supposed to think about as you design with text. And so one thing I want you to, as you're looking at type in design, ask yourself, is the typeface I'm using appropriate? Is it in keeping with the message I'm communicating? Are you using more than one typeface? Are they contrasting or conflicting? How well do they work together? Is the size right for the medium or message? Are you using a typeface that's timeless or classic, or will the typeface be the equivalent of sort of the 80 shoulder pads, sort of out next week? So think about that as you look at design and look at type and design. What makes the type work? How does it improve the design, not only in what the words are saying, but also in the type being imagery or visuals that are part of the layout? So this week you're going to be emailed a word or statement, and you're going to communicate that word or statement through the way that you lay it out and create the letters. So one clever strategy actually coming to this design would be to, if let's say your word is allowing you to put a graphic in, you can replace one of the letters in your word with a graphic. And so that could be a clever strategy. They do this in this design where they're sort of replacing one of the letters with a graphic. The V becomes an arrow and the A becomes an arrow. And because we understand what these words say, it's a really good strategy. They're also using this really nice thing with alignment. They're using the length of this line here to lay out their other text, which I think is really clever. Let me get down to where some of the letters are. This is another example of it where spook, they use the O's in a really clever way where they made them into these like kind of googly eyes, and it really works with the font. This is kind of a font that maybe looks a little bit like some of the old psychedelic poster design fonts. And so it's kind of fun, has an energetic feel. So your word that you're emailed will need to be communicated. And so you're going to need to think of a way to lay this word out and communicate your message. Let me get to it. Infected. This is a great example. So this would be your word, infected. And the strategy that you would use would be to hand draw and to make the actual word infected look like it's a disease happening in the space. Dieting. Beautiful strategy here. Communicating that concept really in a simple, clean, efficient way, but it's making a lot of sense. Water. This could be a good strategy, replacing part of a letter or a whole letter with a graphic. That's appropriate. You can't, in this assignment, you can't put in graphics in addition to the word. So you couldn't have the word water with drops of water all around the graphic. That's outside of the project specifications. If you are going to put a graphic in, it needs to replace a letter or become part of a letter, connect with a letter. That's the only way that you can do it. But it's a really actually clever strategy if it works well. Hiccup, love this one. Titanic. You can also use the frame, so you can have your word sort of slide in and out of the frame as long as it stays legible. That's another really important thing. It's going to have to stay legible and readable. And you're also going to have to do two variations or solve the problem in two ways. So look at the assignment because you're not just going to be doing one solution. You're really going to be thinking about it and doing two solutions for this assignment, two different solutions, communicating the idea differently. Disorientated. So you can rotate letters. You can sort of use kerning to space them out a little bit more. You can do whatever you want with your letters as long as the word itself stays legible. So if you were to show it to someone, they would still be able to read it. Inside. Oops. So you can hand draw, which is what I recommend, because unless you have a lot of experience on a software program, hand drawing can be a really good solution. And then you're just going to scan it in or photograph it. There will be Open Lab when you can go in and get some help from our TA, Sirapat. Inbred. So modifying a letter just really simply can have a huge impact. Echo. So try to express the meaning of the word through spacing, sizing, placement of the letters, adding a graphic in place of a letter or adding a graphic to a letter. They're doing it in this one, but I don't want you to do it. In this one, they're kind of doing a clever thing where they're repeating the T a bunch of times to communicate the concept of elimination. You're not really allowed to do that. You only want to use the letters of the word you're given. And you don't want to communicate the concept through repetition. You're only allowed one letter in the design, so you can't multiply a letter. So I put this in here because I think it's a really clever design, but you're not allowed to do this. So don't do it. This is another example of replicating a letter, but don't do that to communicate the idea, even though it's clever. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. This is always a fun assignment. You're going to be emailed your word or statement. You have to do two variations, solve the problem in two different ways. I really want you to look at that little video called Word as Image. It's in the videos this week, and it shows this wonderful sort of fun, animated kinetic type. And it kind of shows you a lot of different words and how they were messaged in this video. And so use layout of letters, brainstorm by sketching. That's always a good thing to do before you start. And use only type unless the graphic replaces the letter shape. And if you're struggling with software, you don't want to use software, then just use hand draw these letters or use cut and paste methods. You can cut letters out of magazines and use them. And just really pay attention to the presentation. You're graded on the presentation, so it has to look good, even though you might be hand drawing. Spend time on it. Do multiple versions. And if you need some help, just come to the open lab. And this is going to definitely be a peer review project, so you're going to be assigned other students to peer review, and you're going to give them feedback on this. So have fun, and let me know if you have any questions.